Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, or whatever it may be your time, and welcome to another question and answers with Andy, and Ask Andy Anything, which, much like our previous ones, will be the last one that I intend to do. I started off this entire Ask Andy Anything journey purely as I finished work for the day. I've got a stream coming up at 7 o'clock over on the Rookery. I've got about an hour. Let's just pop up a quick Ask Andy Anything. And that's turned into episode 8 of doing the same thing each week. So the same rules as always apply. If you have a question, slap it up in the comments and I will try to get to it. But as we have seen from our previous weeks, I very rarely get to all of them. In fact, I almost never do because there are just so many questions coming in. That being the case, I have a couple of rules that I think will make this a little bit clearer. First, if you drop a super chat our way, as in if you're willing to throw money in this direction, I will always answer those because it would be rude not to. So if you do throw a super chat, or alternatively, if you throw bits up, if you're watching over on Twitch, I will make sure to get to that. On a second one, I will try to answer all the other ones too, but I am going to miss a bunch. Be aware of that. It's not personal. It is certainly not by intention. It's just that I often get so many questions in. So I'm going to just ram through them as quickly as I possibly can. But beyond that, hello all! It's really nice to see you again after another week. It's been a really busy one over on my side. I have piped 2 books out this week, actually. Really rather pleased. One for a game called Solasta, which if you Google, you'll find. And another one, am I marked on that one? And another one as well. I won't discuss that one until possibly later. So I'm going to drop in immediately with our super chats because Hammond dropped in some at the very beginning. Hey, Hammond, thanks so much for dropping by. Is it a tabletop game that lets you be evil? I think I see what you're doing there. If you don't know already, everybody, we've got a game called Dark Deeds, which you can now pre-purchase from Modiphius Games. If you just go over to Modiphius and type in Dark Deeds, you will find it. Or alternatively, if you're watching over on YouTube, you'll find a link for Dark Deeds and pre-purchasing it sitting down in the comments. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Hammond. If you don't know what it is, Dark Deeds, you play a minion to an evil and mysterious patron who you are attempting to impress through your, strangely enough, dark deeds. It's a quick, fast, fun board game. It takes about an hour or so to play and is super, super cool and fun. And is filled with some of the best artwork you'll ever see from Games Workshop legend Mark Gibbons, and is also designed by another Games Workshop legend, Andy Chambers. And if I do say so myself, I helped out too. So that's that one. And on that one, haha, I maybe should have read ahead. Who are the creators? What work have they done? So on one side, we have Andy Chambers, who you may know from pretty much every single Warhammer army list all the way back. Well, he didn't do all. He did Skaven. I think he did High Elves back in the day as well. He did a bunch of the old Warhammer army lists. He also did a ton of 40k stuff, right, ranging from 2nd edition onwards. You'll know Andy's work really well if you've played either of those games. On the art side, Mark Gibbons, you will definitely know his work from both Warhammer and 40k. He pretty much did the core art for most of the special characters we know and love today. Everything ranging from the Gash all the way to Orion and Ariel to pretty much all of them. He just, the Green Knight. God, that picture is good. So yes, he's doing the art in it. It's absolutely marvelous. And of course, I was involved with writing the rules in there too. Right. So I do believe I'm going to give a quick thank you to Admiral Apparent. Thanks very much, Admiral Apparent, for bringing that rather nice little chat in there. Let me also say thank you very much to Hawk Audley for popping up the links for Dark Deeds over on Twitch if you happen to be over there. I'm now just going to jump into the questions and let's see what we have this week. So I'm just going to bring up the first one that pops up and we get one from Jeff. Hey, Jeff, thanks very much for the questions. If you've been watching the previous couple of streams, Jeff has had quite a number of questions and we are apparently all the way up at number 10. What matter or manner of demon or demon prince was the hag demon, the pox mother at the gallows tree? Now, if you've been watching the Lorebeard streams that I do with Lore Master Sotek, we did one very recently in Tamarkan. Tamarkan, that great Nurgle champion, one of the 4 brothers who were attempting to ascend into, I suppose, the throne of chaos. And the good old pox mother pops up in there, a hag demon who effectively prophesizes much of what Tamarkan needs to learn about to progress onwards with his great attempt at ascension to demon princehood. It doesn't in any greater way discuss exactly what the hag demon is, but it does to a degree give you some details. For example, it makes it quite clear that she's tied directly to the gallows tree. They're up in the realm of chaos, way far north, where reality itself has begun to bend and demons can exist in perpetuity. Further, they do add on that hag feeling that really does bring up reminiscent tones from Kislev. So whilst they don't necessarily describe it, you could very easily, if you wished, tie this through to the hags of Kislev. You could easily tie it through to many of the old hedge witch types that you get across the old world. And given where she is in the greater scheme of things in terms of her geography up at the north, it'd be very easy to tie her through to that. But I think if you were attempting to drop it down, she would probably be a demon prince or something equivalent, but it's not properly answered in there. Okay, pulling out another one as we drop down. Hey, Charles CK. Nice. You mentioned before about how Dark Elves are the most charismatic and they forgive quickly. Forgive, not necessarily the term I would use. If I did say that word, I'm going to readdress it. Does this apply only to other Dark Elves, or are they almost also diplomatic with other species races? Right, so there is something to mention here. The 8th edition army list took some time, not a great amount, there's a couple of paragraphs here or there, to try and justify how the Dark Elves could exist and work as a species, yet still be so unremittingly evil and treacherous in terms of how our moral standards as typical humans would judge such things. And one of the things they did in there was they made it very clear that Dark Elves are, of all the various races of elves, one of the most charismatic, because they are very used to persuading people around to their way of thinking, because often it will be enemies that need to work together, so they need to take that extra step. Now, another thing to mark about Dark Elves is that they think they're better than literally everybody else. So does this apply to others? Now, the first answer is yes, of course it does, because they are still charismatic. They are still capable of getting people to do what they want. And that's not just because they're a horrible species that uses slaves and all manner of other horrible things. They are very charismatic. The question is, I think more pertinently, would they? And in the vast majority of cases, the answer is always going to be no, because you are beneath them. The only reason they would ever attempt to persuade someone around to their way of thinking was if they couldn't force you around to their way of thinking. And even that would be an admittance on their part that they were somehow weaker because they couldn't force you to do something. That being the case, there would definitely be reservations, particularly coming from others, that if they were seen to be reaching out to others to ally with them or any equivalent, they would be seen by their peers as weak and needing support from outside. So the question there is, could they? Yes. Would they? It would require special circumstances. Right. So moving past there, we've got a nice big one there from Hammond. Hey, Hammond, thanks very much for dropping the super chat. And realistically, do you think Warhammer Fantasy would have been as enjoyable today if they had kept the first, second, and third edition crazy weird lore? Right. So I'm going to gently describe this or anyone who doesn't know out there. The first and second edition largely didn't really have any lore. What it had was all manner of fantasy species that they'd taken from other settings and given rules for. It was primarily almost a role-play war game amalgam, much like the very first Rogue Trader for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was almost an amalgam. It kind of wanted a games master. It was telling stories through their battles. But the battles that they presented were relatively generic in terms of how fantasy is presented. And the Warhammer world as we know and love it today didn't really exist. Come third edition, that changed. The Warhammer world was very much the thing. We had our first maps of it. We had our first idea of where all the species, all the factions, all the groups would come from. They started merging, some of which have been dropped today because they're early renditions of them from the mid-80s, really, for third edition. Some of them were what we would now determine to be pretty goddamn racist. They were not very well handled. And some of those have been updated in time. Others have been dropped entirely. Some of the more famous locations like Nippon, for example, which back then had a full army. Nowadays, they don't really touch, but they're almost certain to, assuming that the old world does well, approach it again. And hopefully, of course, we'll get it in Total War as well. But if we take a look at, say, for example, their pygmy options, really not very well done at all. Now, would it be as enjoyable today if they'd kept any of the crazy or weird lore from then? I think they've kept a lot more than most people realize. They have adapted it, they developed it, made it bigger, and often crazier than the original. I would argue that the original was less crazy and more racist. and less sensitive to cultural sensitivities around the world. When you take a little look at what comes later, do we still have the flying ships that Jean Blanche dropped in for the third edition of the game? Yeah, damn straight we do. And the dwarves have got them flying through the air with their thunder barges. So I think you'll find that most of it has been pretty accurately translated over in one fashion or another. We've lost a lot of the stranger monsters because a lot of those came from different parts of the world that Warhammer no longer currently covers, but as they eventually reach those places, we'll just get new versions. So I don't think it would necessarily be better. Hey, Gideon, thank you so much for the super chat. That's super appreciated, and enormously so, in fact. When the old ones modified the world, did they create all of the non-tropical plants and animals that inhabit the newly defrosted? I almost said deforested parts of the world, or did they quickly evolve from tropical species? Now, this is super fascinating. Originally, when the old ones first arrived in silver ships, they came. The Warhammer world was significantly further away from the sun, and they moved the Warhammer world closer, warming it. And the world, as it was at that point, had basically a band of life where the temperature was compatible with easy life, and then it froze up towards the north where it was actually inhospitable at the poles. And by moving it in, they turned it into a bunch of zones that are not entirely dissimilar to Earth in terms of its overall temperatures. But the Warhammer world's bigger, so the way its biomes work are slightly different. Next one is, did they import life? And the answer is we don't know specifically, but the answer is yes. They imported absolutely tons. Everything that was already existing in the world, they adapted. Anything that they didn't want to adapt, they destroyed. The Saurus warriors, pretty much like a tide, went across the world, supported by their lizardmen, destroying everything in their path. However, not everything easily capitulated. As we know, the dragons put up a pretty goddamn good fight, and in some cases, held them off. Similarly, we know that the dragon ogres did not go down very well, eventually chose chaos over the alternative. So, yeah, there was an awful lot of warfare and bloodshed as the world warmed. An awful lot was changed by the lizard men, who were basically the pawns of the old ones. And the old ones did indeed change. Now, to say that, did they create all of the plants or did they adapt? We have no clear way of answering that for certain. But I will say that evolution doesn't normally move that quickly. But you've also got to remember that we had the cataclysm. Where the cataclysm came, chaos flooded the world, as in magic flooded the world, and that brought change. And that change will have significantly changed many of the plants of the world as well. So the answer is somewhat long and convoluted. Hey, Ryland. Thanks very much. Enormously appreciated. Hey, Andy. Long time watcher. Yay. First time chatter. Oh, well, let me take time to chat with you then, Ryland. Thank you very much. With the return of the old world in an earlier setting prior to the Great War against Chaos, could we see a return of the Mordheim game or perhaps a similar game? Thank you, sir. I think that's very likely if the old world does really well. Now, for those of us who've been watching its development, it's fair to say that there's a lot about that game that fills us with a certain amount of criticism. We can't help it. The army lists, for want of a better term, are pretty thin and rubbish. The armies as they're being presented are just the old models with a couple of new models peppered in. It feels kind of cheap, but it's still Warhammer. The game itself is great, and it's hopefully doing really well. And if it does really well, I think something like Mordheim absolutely could come again. After all, we got, he said, pointing up in the direction, you can't see up there, but I've got my Necromunda sets up there. Necromunda came back in a new form, and I think Mordheim would be ripe for that. For any of you who haven't played Mordheim, it's a lovely skirmish game set inside the Warhammer world, and it's set about 500 years before the Warhammer world goes boom. And the core setting has a comet slicing through the sky and landing in the city of Mordheim, effectively blowing it up, called the Hammer of Sigmar most commonly. And this spread weirdstone, warpstone everywhere. Although, strictly speaking, the warpstone that they have there is a bit different. So just calling it weirdstone is better. And all manner of different gangs rise up to try and grab it. If you haven't played the computer game, give it a quick recommendation. It's quite a bit of fun. It's an interesting mixture of strategy and action all rolled into one. Pretty close in terms of what the original Mordheim game offered. So worth having a look at if you haven't tried. So I think it's very likely. Obviously, I'm not inside Games Workshop, so I can't say that for certain, but I can definitely say that if I was there and the Warhammer world was doing well, I would be very keen to see it go some further there. Moving down to the Laughing God. Thank you very much, Laughing God. Hey, Andy. Hope you're well. I am. I was wondering, is it possible for characters to get blessed by multiple non-chaos gods? Seems unfair they cannot. So the answer is yes, they can, but to a degree. You'll find that at various points in various books, the core rule, and the core rule is you can only be blessed by a single god. And if you're blessed by a god, you pretty much can't do magic. You can't do anything else. The god pretty much encapsulates everything that is your soul, gets broken. I'll give a single example of that, the one that you were obliquely referencing, which was multiple chaos gods. Archeon is ever chosen, has 4 who bless him. Similarly, you'll find that there have been, in the past, a variety of characters that have been possessed who have been enhanced, who have received the benefit of multiple gods. Sometimes in the roleplay books, if we take, for example, Ashes of Middenheim. Ashes of Middenheim was an adventure that was written by Graham Davis for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. And in there, the characters, or one of the characters, gets marked by a rune, effectively like similar to a chaos mark, but for, you know, the good gods. And it showed the blessing of both Sigmar and Ulrich, a mark of unification. And indeed, the god Ulrich himself speaks effectively, blessing that individual character with enormous potential power within the cult of Ulrich at the same time. So the answer to that one is yes, they can, but it takes something particularly unique. So it won't be covered by the core rules, because generally speaking, it can't happen, because metaphysically, once you are aligned to a single god, that's it. You are aligned to that god and you're pretty much done. Okay, moving over to the other chat side. I'm just going to make sure I haven't had any bits coming, because it doesn't show up in the piece of software that I've got here. So if there's anyone over on Twitch, I might miss it. So I'm just running down just to double check there's any bits before I finish off the rest of the super chats. Doesn't look like there is. I should now pop over back to the super chats and get those finished. Right, so we were just on the Laughing God. That means we moved to the Bloat Person. Hey, the Bloat Person. Always nice to see you out there. Your name always makes me smile. The Bloat Person. Speaking of elves, yes, I recall reading that they've used slaves even pre-schism. Would you have subjected any pre-imperial Bretonian human populations they met in the old world? Would they have subjected them? Pardon me. So, speaking of elves, yeah, the high elves, the writers have always been super cagey in how they've pitched this. They'll often have indentured people who are perhaps indebted, people who are perhaps more like serfs that might be working in, say, Lothern. And different writers have approached it slightly differently, but the undercurrent of all of them is that the high elves have slaves also. They don't necessarily call them the same thing, but they're equivalent of pleasure slaves. They're the equivalent of peoples who basically do their bidding. The lives that they provide are obviously significantly different to, say, for example, how dark elves use external populaces, where they believe themselves better than everything else around them, and they just use anything around them as a resource that they will use as at a whim. And often that will involve the death of their slaves. They are not nice people. Where the high elves bluntly have this scheme of being better, but aren't necessarily. The wood elves, by comparison, you could argue, don't. Until you start looking between the lines, and then you realize that, say, for example, what's happening in Bretonia, with the damsels, with the men who can use magic, and how they get taken into the court. There's a couple of short stories behind there that effectively shows they enslave humanity as well, and that is run through Ladriel herself. And there's the lady herself, I apologize, which is definitely, they're definitely not the same, which is definitely worth looking at. So the concepts of slavery for the elves is very much a thing, but they don't necessarily always call it slavery. Basically, it's we're better than you, and we are happy using you as a tool. The extreme of that is the dark elves. The other various races of the elves have got different versions. Now, were they doing that right from the beginning? The answer is almost certainly yes. Elves think they're better than others. But you'll find that it's a cagey subject. So I will conclude that it would not surprise me if Games Workshop not only steers away from that, they decide it definitely isn't the case. They can't really do that with the Dark Elves, given how much it's intrinsic to that species now. So I can't see it going from the Dark Elves, but I could definitely see it being toned down on other sides, just because it's a little bit icky. And they're trying to pitch the Elves often as good guys. Hey, Phil, do you believe Mork and Gork abandoned the Hobgoblins after their betrayal? That's cunning. well, we'll get onto that. If why they seem to have a better time fitting in with the other races and species of the Warhammer world. So, I would be very interested to see what they do as background for the Hobgoblins as they attempt to develop them further from the relatively weak versions that we've had presented of them inside, say, for example, the Chaos Dwarf Army List that came out for Warhammer, I'm going to guess 5th edition. It was just basically white dwarf articles all piled together into an army list. Or alternatively, the Tamarkan versions. You've also got things like Hobgoblin who popped up as a character in more than one place, and these are based upon ancient Warhammer 3rd edition Warhammer to go all the way back to the question that was pitched by Hammond earlier on. Would it be a better background if we still had those bits? Well, we kind of still do. It's where the Hobgoblins largely came from. And they never fit in very well with what they turned the Greenskins into as we moved into 4th edition. And as 40k took those ideas and took them even further with Mork and Gork. And Mork and Gork and what 40k did and what Warhammer did kind of doesn't mix with, say, the Noblars, say, the Hobgoblins, the various other greenskin races. They have not really integrated them frightfully well. So I think with the Hobgoblins, unless there's been something popped up inside Total War that I'm yet aware of, which very well may be the case, I think that you could argue that they abandoned them after their betrayal, but I think that would be weak sauce, particularly given that Mork and Gork, or Gork and Mork, do love their cunning tricks. I mean, just take a look at the good old goblins. The Hobgoblins have done nothing that's particularly backstabby, more so than any other greenskin. It's just their reputation is particularly strong for it because they do it again and again. If they did write that in, I would suggest that the writer at hand was not necessarily thinking it through as well as they could. They would need to make it something super deep to make it a worthwhile abandoning. So my personal preference would be no, but it wouldn't surprise me if they took that route. And do they have a better time fitting in with the other species? I think that is arguable. Deeply so. They are forced into it through slavery with the Chaos Dwarves, and they're forced to work with others in a variety of ways that they might not otherwise have done so because of the Chaos Dwarves. I don't think they necessarily fit in better per se, although there are many stories of the various northern steppes. I'd say it's debatable still, though. It's an interesting question, Phil. It's one that we haven't had properly answered, so it's difficult for me to pin anything down. Hey, Heron, favorite obscure little-known Ostermark fact? I love a lot about Ostermark. I've used Ostermark many times in my campaigns. I've had campaigns focused there. I've had PCs and NPCs come from there. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, I play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay a lot. I've written for that game so a lot over the past couple of decades or so. And Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay in particular has added most of the detail for Ostermark. And in there, you get yourself this strong idea of the hardy folk that live out on the eastern side of the empire. And one thing that I do particularly like about them, whether it's the Griffin Wood, which lies to the north with a capital up there, but Beckhaven up at the top, is one of the best barge building locations in the entirety of the empire, which is often forgotten because it's so far upstream. But then Kislev gets most of its barges, for example, from the capital of Ostermark, which I think is kind of fun. So there's a nice little sidey fact. Hey, Queek, Vermintide versus Greentide. Who would outlast the other? Under normal circumstances, if we're looking at being relatively equal, the greenskins often will prevail. But it depends upon exactly where you're fighting. If we're fighting above ground, greenskins are almost certainly going to have the advantage. If we're fighting below ground, the rats often have an advantage. But there's different greenskins who really, really excel below ground. Equally, there's different rats that really do well above ground. The vermin stroke green tide combo here is one that I think you could argue either way. So I'm instead going to say who's leading them, what are their capabilities, because orcs rely upon a strong leader. If they don't have one, they fragment into individual tribes. Similarly, the Skaven are constantly politicking and backbiting and attacking each other, and getting them to actually deploy a large force requires something exceedingly special, typically the intervention of the Council of 13. And if that's going to happen, then the Green Tide's probably in trouble, unless it itself is behind someone particularly impressive. So the answer for this one is sadly deeply, deeply debatable and very hard to pin down. What time am I at? Because I want to make sure I get through all of these, and I'd like to get some non-super chat questions as well. Admiral Apparent comes in. Hey, Admiral Apparent, thank you very much for the chat. Hugely appreciated. Messed up super chat the first time. It happens sometimes. I apologize. Did you drop in earlier and I didn't get the chat? Yes, you did. I got you there for the 199. I apologize for that. In terms of protection, is Chaos Dwarf or WFRP better? Which do you prefer? Always enjoyed fancy metals. So they go into some detail about this, about how many of the Chaos Dwarf armors, particularly the armors that are used in the north that were made by Chaos Dwarfs, are the Chaos armors that we all know along. Chaos armor is ridiculous. Demon-bound stuff inside it. Often armor that you can't take off once you've got it on, where Dawi armor, depending upon the armor, could be made of Gromril, could be covered in runes. There's all manner of stuff. They both effectively are seeped with magic. Which are better? Neither. They both bring advantages, and in the case of the Chaos side, potentially some significant disadvantages, but also significant advantages along with that. Dawi armor by its nature doesn't include runes. That requires a runesmith to come along later and add to it, where the Chaos Dwarf at their best, oh my goodness, they're really knocking it home with some of what they can offer. Which do I prefer? I don't prefer either. I think each brings something unique and fun to the table, particularly given that the Chaos Dwarves also deal in all the metals that they and more that the Dwarves deal with. So don't really prefer either. Both of them bring something super fun to the table. I do deeply prefer having the Chaos Dwarves involved, because for large periods of the history of Warhammer, the Chaos Dwarves not only weren't there because they hadn't written them, they were written out. So it's really nice to see them back in, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, nice one. Hey, Hammond. Can Dodgy, that's really not how you spell Dodgy, but that sounds good. Dodgy, it's D-O-D. Never mind. Dodgy Johan, for those of you who don't know, that's the advisor from Warhammer Total War. Possibly be a projection of Drachenfels. I really doubt it. What other entities do you think he could have been? Tinfoil hat. Okay, so is he? Could he possibly be? That's different to is he? Could he possibly be a projection of Drachenfels? Given the nature of his character, absolutely not. Drachenfels makes Dark Elves seem measly when it comes to their arrogance. Drachenfels' arrogance is beyond anything around them. He thinks he's above demons. He thinks he's above gods. He thinks he's above all of that. He was around when the old ones first came. He was around when the whole Warhammer world came to an end. So are there other entities that he could have been? Yeah, if you want a real tinfoil hat, you could argue that Nagash was nothing more than an influence of Drachenfels, largely because he was the replacement in some respects that Warhammer lore had for Drachenfels, because they didn't want to reuse a character that had been created solely by somebody else, in this case Kim Newman, largely because there was also a certain amount of uncertainty regarding exactly who held the IP, to the point that the intellectual property was uncertain right up to the end times, and they didn't even use the name Drachenfels. Instead, they called him the Nameless One when they moved into the end times. So that character was still there and then made subordinate to Nagash, but I'm quite certain that you could bring out some really cool tinfoil hat theories regarding that. Also from Hammond, if the whole Scottish people of the late medieval era were teleported to Warhammer, where would they fit and blend in better? Kislev or Middenland? Probably Middenland. Kislev is... Yeah, probably Middenland. I had to think in that one for a minute. I was thinking about between the pair. The Middenland has many of the similar warlike traditions in terms of the stereotypes, although Scotland was no more warlike than anywhere else in the world. But it has certainly had a lot of those traditions. It has perhaps less of the fairy tale Celtic myth wrapped around it, which you do get to a degree from the Kislev version that you get over in the old world. But I think out of the pair, if I was to drop it in one, I'd definitely say Middenland. My personal preference would be Nordland, which you could argue is a part of Middenland, because in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1, it sort of was, or at least part of Middenheim. Hey, Ryland, Magnus the Pious received a model. He did originally. He didn't actually get the model, but he did get rules. What sort of things should we expect or hope for? Are there any other that you'd like to see get one? Yeah. So Magnus had rules in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, 4th edition. He was one of the special characters at the back of the Empire army list. And he was basically just a normal human who was possessed with the power of Sigmar every once in a while, where he could wallop out big, huge, giant strength 10 hits, which was pretty goddamn freaking awesome. However, he was eminently quite killable. Much like the original Karl Franz, he wasn't necessarily that great per se, but that developed over the course of time with each later edition. Magnus the Pious, though, was certainly a super fun character, and he has already had rules. As to whether there's anything I'd like to see get rules, so much. In particular, let's just stick with the Empire, because that alone suggests way more than we really need. The 8 colleges of magic have long had different leaders, and they have generally only ever worried about one, and that's the Supreme Patriarch, whoever it may be. So we got a Thyrus Gorman model, and we got ourselves a Balthazar Gelt model, but we certainly didn't get somebody like, say, Vespasian Kant, the Patriarch of the Light Order, who has been in books, he's talked in novels, he's been in the roleplay game, he's all over the place, yet never given actual rules. I would also be quite keen to get someone like Tochter Grumfeld, the matriarch of the Jade College, largely because there is an absolute dearth of decent female models in the Empire Army list. At least as it currently stands. And there is a mighty mass of female characters in the roleplay game that have been mentioned again and again across the various novels. So I'd very much like to see several of those. But if I was to pick out one that I can't believe they never did, Finubar. Seriously, he's the freaking Phoenix King. Why was he never done? Makes zero sense. Hey, Sean, how much of an old Warhammer lore is just British humor or puns? Oh, I'd say about 90%. Did you do any of the books you helped on? Did you do any, pardon me, in the books you helped on? Oh, yeah. I have dropped more puns and references and terrible Britishisms in my work than many people realize. But I tend to avoid the really obvious stuff. And that's because many of the stuff from, say, 3rd edition and 4th edition Warhammer, or 1st edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, was puns based upon other countries' use of language. So they were ever so slightly racist, certainly making fun out of other people's cultures in a way that just could have been handled better. But of course, it was done in the way that those things were done in the 80s. In no way do I blame the people for their writing back then, because that would be foolish. They weren't writing ahead of their time. I don't look at that and say that was bad. How dare they do that? Instead, I look at it and I say that was of its time. I was writing a bit later than the original ones, so I was somewhat more sensitive. But yes, there are not only many a pun and a British reference throughout my work that I wrote for Fantasy Roleplay, my bits and pieces for Black Library, but also many of the maps as well, where even right down to place names, there's sometimes just a silly name. And in quotations that I might have, the most famous of which is, say, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Ed, was just a reference to a very famous song from the 80s where a priest of Mor mentions quite clearly. It's inside the Priest Career. If you've got a copy of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, one of the quotations in the Priest Career says, come the midnight hour, we all cry more, more, more. And I'm sure that there's a few people out there who will recognize that. That's not the full quotation. There's a bit more to it. The quotation is attributed to Wilhelm Abgott, a priest of Mor. And if you know any very rudimentary German, you'll be able to pull apart what Wilhelm Abgott may be referencing. So the answer is definitely a yes. Phil! If Malachi's homeland was supposed to be in Albion, indeed, was there supposed to have been an entire dwarf community living there? Yeah, and frequently the dwarves were placed in Albion in older material, particularly if we go back to Warhammer 1st edition, where there was kilt-wearing dwarfs all over the place, many of the old models were given bagpipes. They were referenced throughout some of the older products. So the answer is yes, there was historically dwarves living in Albion. Whether they continue to live in Albion at a later date is most certainly up for grabs with later Warhammer writers. If I wrote Albion today, yes, there would be dwarves and there'd be entire dwarven communities up in the north of Albion that I would add to it. I was going to be writing an Albion book back in approximately 2020, so only about 4 years ago. And I was going to be writing that book along with Gav Thorpe, because Gav Thorpe had done the vast majority of the treatments from Albion that were still considered to be up to date. And I really am using heavy quotations here because they've been added all the way back for a campaign called Dark Shadows. Now, the Dark Shadows campaign was a big summer campaign for Warhammer where everybody invaded Albion for their own reasons. It was a bit silly, super over the top, lots of fun. And Gav and I were working on a campaign together that moved through Albion, and we were going to do an Albion book. And yes, there was going to be dwarves in it. I'm almost done all the super chats, everyone. So I will hopefully be moving back to the other chats. I'll also skim through to check if there's any bits. The Age of Sigmar Skaven didn't change. We need a new universe. So still loading. I kind of agree. I really wish they'd done more with the Skaven in Age of Sigmar, but I know why they didn't. No, I don't know why they didn't, but it seems obvious why they didn't. It's because the Skaven were one of the few entirely unique creations that Warhammer had, meaning that they didn't need to change it into something new to make it unique, to make it a unique piece of IP that wouldn't be easy to copy by other people. That without, infringing their copyright. So the Skaven didn't need the big update. So sadly, they didn't get one, meaning that the Skaven that we get how many bajillion or tens of thousands years after Warhammer, basically the Skaven that we had in Warhammer. And whilst there might be the tiniest of changes, they are all pretty goddamn small. I'm a little saddened by that, but I'll also say I'm actually really pleased by it, because it means that if you happen to be a Skaven fan and you want to get yourself a bunch of new models for your Warhammer armies, you can. You can just buy yourself the Age of Sigmar ones, and they like for like pretty much port over. A slight conversion here or there for some of them, but whatever. It's pretty much done. Really nice as far as I'm concerned. Hey, Jaguar Philosopher, nice name. Thanks very much for the super chat. Was Arbal present at the Siege of Kislev with Azavar? Cool. If so, how do you survive without getting destroyed by Khorne? Right, there's a big difference, it's worth noting, between losing a battle and losing the war. Azavar Kul lost, but that doesn't mean Arbal, the Undefeated, lost any of his individual fights. And you'll find that Arbal is again and again involved with campaigns that don't necessarily come out as a win. That doesn't mean that Arbal ever lost. Now, off the top of my head, I can't remember any references to Arbal being there, although he may have been. That's really annoying. I'm going to go check that one up, Jaguar Philosopher, because I can't think of one off the top of my head. I remember when I was doing the research for Kislev, he wasn't mentioned. When we did the Empire at War book and we covered the Siege of Kislev, I did a big double spread map for the Siege of Kislev in that. Again, Arbal didn't pop up, but he might have been added in because that was just before 8th edition came out. And I'm trying to remember the Arbal lore from 8th edition, but I, again, don't remember anything popping up. So if anyone knows in the chat, if he did pop up, do say so. But I can't think of any examples where he did. But I will take the core of that question anyway and confirm it. And that is, Arbal can easily be a part of a Chaos Force that loses. It's just Arbal himself doesn't lose because he then fights his way back out again, because the dude is indeed undefeated. Why didn't you name a judge, lawmaker, and druid? Well, I sort of did. There was an Andreas Richter. Andreas Richter popped up in a couple of the things that I wrote, which was nothing more than a quick amusing aside reference to myself. Andreas for Andrew, Richter for law. Andreas Richter, though, wasn't a judge or lawmaker in this case. Andreas Richter was a cartographer, which was super fun. Okay, I'm now going to check for any of the super chats. Thank you very much for bearing with me as we go through all those. Those were really good. Thanks a load. Right, I'm not seeing any. Just bring up that one there from Hawk. That'd be having fucking with you, misspelling dodgy. Every single time I read it. Hey, Dino Man, every single time I read his spelling of dodgy, I say it wrong. And I'm like, what's he referring to? Georgia Dodge. Oh, dodgy you want. I see. Hey, Dino Man, thanks very much for the bits. Are there any stories of wood elves fighting forest goblins? I imagine having the giant birds and spiders fight each other among the trees would be super fun. And indeed it is. You tend to find, though, that the forest goblins, if you take a look at the various maps, don't claim territory around there because the elves kick their butt pretty much every single time, because they have to actually seed their way into the place and then move through it. But by that point, the elven forests where they are utterly dominated by the elves. And whenever the greenskins move into it, they're pretty much pushed out. Having said that, though, yes, they do, whenever they're encountered, fight bitterly, and I could not agree more. Giant birds, spiders doing their thing is super fun, particularly you look at some of the more ridiculous examples with the Arachnaroks. But you tend to find, though, that most of the forest goblin, in fact, if I go through all the stories I'm thinking on, almost all of their stories tend to be old world stories with a predominant amount of them coming from the Empire, the Forest of Shadows, often in particular. You get a bunch from the Border Princes as well, where they're often dropped in some of the major forests that you get in the Border Princes. but you tend to find that no, they do not pop up very often amongst the elves. Alrighty, so I think that's me up to date. I'm not seeing any more bits. I'm going to scroll right down to the bottom there. Just make sure I've not missed anything. And move on to another question. Right, let's just pick out one from the many. I'm just going to grab the first one that pops up and go with that one. Let's see what it is. That's a really interesting one. How many dark elves die per death night? Wow, that's a question and a half, and also speaks to a certain degree about how dark elves themselves have not necessarily been well considered in terms of how they work. But if you don't know out there, the dark elves have a special night called Death Night, considered like the Purge from the movies, where everyone goes a bit mental, in particular the witch elves. It's Cain's night, and they go screaming through the streets, dragging anyone they can, kicking and screaming up to the altars of Cain to be properly sacrificed to Cain, to draw all their blood out, give that to their hag queens, revivify them with youth for one more year. Everything is marvelous. That's definitely a thing. Now, how many die, I think, is by its very nature, much like how many dark elves are there or how big are dark elf cities. You'll tend to find that an awful lot of those questions aren't answered, because to answer them, you start to realize it doesn't necessarily work very well until we get ourselves a role-playing book that attempts to actually make it all work. At best, we can say quite a number, as many as the story at hand needs. Anyone foolish enough to go out in the streets on Death Night, well, they get what they deserve. And if they don't go out, you tend to find the witch elves will be breaking down doors. So if you've not properly defended yourself, again, you get what you deserve. It's fair to say that that's a tough question to pin anything down on, particularly when you've got, say, a city like Harganeth, where the entire city apparently gets involved with it. So yeah, that's a tough beat to answer, but a super fascinating one. Hey, Nels, in the Dragons of Cathay, Sotek dropped the idea of the Shadow Dragon residing in the pond. Yep, we discussed that at some length, actually. Love that idea. How would you run with that idea? My campaign in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I'm thinking of linking it to the Shinobi Dragon Below Conspiracy. Now, that's a fine idea, particularly using the idea of shadow, of the shadow magic that the dragon could be deploying, being used to justify some of the stereotypes you get in Japan. But I would deeply steer away from this if I were doing it myself. And my primary reason for doing so would be that effectively what you're saying is something that is culturally Japanese comes from China. And I would prefer not to do that. I am always leery of taking somebody else's culture and saying, you know, that thing that is a part of your history, even if it's been sensationalized, even if it has gone through the lens of Orientalism, even if it has been effectively repurposed by Hollywood, by manga, by something else, that thing that you identify as yours, actually, we're going to write it into our background that it comes from somewhere else. I don't like that. So I personally wouldn't do that. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't work really well, though. I'm just saying that I personally wouldn't do that. Do I think that having a dragon from effectively from China coming over to Japan and residing there is fun? Definitely. Do I think one of the dragon kids coming over is fun? Definitely. Would I use it that way? No, I would definitely be using it in a far more clandestine way. I would not like it to be even as open as influencing the local people in the way that you're suggesting there with the Shinobi. I would be looking for it doing something that very much speaks to its very nature. So say, for example, you had a situation where Nippon was one thing and Cathay was another. This dragon was going over there to, for example, either A, be a part of what Nippon is, or B, monitor and not be a part of what Nippon is. And in both cases, you could very easily build a really nice shadowy tale that runs behind that. But yeah, I would definitely be careful on that. The Poor Boys, are there any examples of Meridia's blessings? Yeah, there's loads, and I've written around about 20 of them. Meridia gets a few blessings in the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, but they're not strictly speaking Meridian blessings. They're just random blessings that she can use. If you want to see your first examples of them, clearly it's Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, where a bunch were added inside the core book, and then A lot more were added in a book called Tome of Salvation. The Tome of Salvation is a book about religion in the old world, and I wrote huge chunks of that book. And Meridia gets a lot of blessings. Indeed, Meridia gets repitched as a goddess entirely, taking into account many of the changes that had occurred to Warhammer over the course of time, where she is repitched as arguably one of the most important goddesses, one of the most important gods in the entire old world. She certainly has the largest knightly order. She has the most influence. She makes gods like Sigmar look relatively small by comparison. And do they have examples of blessings? Absolutely. Most of the blessings are based around the core concepts of her religion and the teachings from things like the Bellona Meridia, the warrior maiden Meridia, when she manifested down in the Warhammer world and led armies herself. And her blessings effectively make you a better general, give you qualities that are almost eagle-like, give you shining spears and shields. There's a host of things that have been added there. But I recommend, if you want a good start, pop into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition also has more, so worth checking in there as well. That I added inside the religion chapter in there, they were drawn from the 2nd edition versions. You'll find there's also a bunch over in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3rd edition. So the answer to that one is a decided and definite big yes. Still loading. How would you write Shinzu in light of the dragon's fate? I see this still loading. This is a toughie one for me to answer because I actually have a plan for it in my game. So I don't want to say how I would write it because it almost is a spoiler for my game. If you don't know, everyone out there, I need to check the time. Yeah, I'm good on time so far. If you don't know, everyone out there, I play a game called LAWhammer every single week, every Friday, in fact, with some of the coolest peeps in my living room, which is over in that direction, next room across. And we play Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay every single week online, and you can watch us play every week. And we put up the videos for that every Monday afterwards. So we stream it live on the Friday on Twitch, and then we put the videos up on YouTube on the Monday. And this is very possibly going to be a future plot point. So thanks very much for the super chat. But I would like to say, I don't really want to say because it feels like a spoiler. So I'm going to avoid that. And instead, I'm going to say, I'm going to be streaming in about 30 minutes time, a little bit less than 30 minutes time, actually, over on the Rookery side about role-playing, in fact. One of the great jobs of a GM, of a games master, a dungeon master, a keeper, a storyteller, whatever you might call it in your role-playing game of choice, is to run adventures. And most of us, not all of us, but most of us either do one of two things. That's use a pre-published adventure or alternatively make up our own. But for those who use pre-published adventures, you find the vast majority of us don't use what's in the book. We turn it into something that we think works best for us. Some people do lots, some people do little, some people just run it as is. And the stream that I'm going to be doing over on the Rookery in about 28 minutes is how to adapt pre-published adventures well. Now, I've obviously done it professionally in that I've updated existing adventures. I'm also doing it professionally for LAWhammer, professionally. That's really weak sauce. I'm doing it as part of an online stream. That would be better. And I'm adapting the existing The Enemy Within campaign massively. It could not be more different from what's published in the books while simultaneously referring to them. So we're going to be discussing that. Andy Leask is going to be joining us as well because he's done a lot of work on adapting it. And Andy Leask, who's one of our players over in LAWhammer, if you don't watch LAWhammer, and you should, by the way, do hit subscribe. He's one of our players, and he's also worked on Warhammer in the writing side of things. And he's also done some adaptation and updating. For example, he completely did the updates for Bergenhafen. He helped with the updates for Ubersreich, writing the Ubersreich book. And he's got a lot of opinions on this one too. So he's going to be joining us as well. So yeah, that's going to be super fun. That's approximately 7 o'clock. In fact, that is at 7 o'clock. That's where we're going. Hey, the bloke person. Other than the Chaos Gods, can the other gods bless a mortal without them desiring or even knowing it? Or do you need to beseech them first? You do not. The gods often select individuals whether they want it or not, and it can be deeply damaging for that individual in question, particularly given that there are cults out there who will, when they find someone that is blessed by their god, pretty much nab them, drag them off, and say, you're ours now. There are several examples of this inside the existing setting. Living saints or some equivalent that have started to show the blessing of one god or another and then been taken by that god's cult and put on a hill or put in a temple or put in a shrine and largely kept. There's novels where this is the case. If you think of Pergunda, who was blessed by Shalia when she was a child, and still as a child, you meet her in the book, and she's speaking prophecy from Shalia. She never asked for it. She didn't want it. It came upon her. So this is something, the bloat person, that happens a lot. So do be aware that the gods don't necessarily care that much about mortals at all or their opinions. Indeed, it's fair to say the vast majority of them never beseech them first. That might not necessarily be the case, but it often seems that it is. Okay, so that's the end of Super Chats again. We have a bajillion questions there. I'm just going to scroll up at random, stop somewhere, and look at one that says. So if you want to make sure I catch it as a question, do make sure you put an @LAWhammer at the beginning. If you don't, I won't notice a question. I'll scroll by and presume that you're asking somebody else something or just talking to each other or something similar. So I will probably miss it as an actual question. So anyway, I'm going to scroll down now and see if I can find one amongst it. Oh gosh, it's hard because there's so much internal chat amongst them all. And yes, I will say har har har. Andreas Richter, it made me laugh as well, Phil. It was really silly, but it made me laugh. I'll also say, just before I actually bring up the next question, we've just hit 1,000 followers over on Twitch. Before the stream started, I noticed there were 996 followers over on the LAWhammer on Twitch, and I was like, oh, we're almost at 1,000! And a bunch of people went over and brought us over. So I'd like to say super thanks to those of you who brought us over, and also bring up what Jeff said at the time, which was, let this day be marked as the day where LAWhammer joined 1K followers on Twitch. Oh, yes! On that, let's pick up, because I'm right at the very top of all the questions. Let's see if I can grab a quick one from up at the top. Hey, Taika. What are you saying, Taika? You're asking, what's Warhammer equivalent of the ever so popular Strixseed? Weed Moonflower, perhaps. In the lore book, we get Ranulph's Delight. Yes, we do, because I added that in, which is obviously a certain white powder from our world. It certainly could be perceived as that, but actually it isn't, which is also kind of worth mentioning. So the most commonly cited example of something that's like weed inside the Warhammer world is Weirdroot. Weirdroot is a root, strangely enough, that you can chew. It can be refined in a variety of different ways. It can also be smoked. And Weirdroot brings about a similar outcome to something like weed, a good old hemp. But hemp and weed is in the Warhammer world as well. It's been dropped in a couple of places. But you tend to find that Warhammer often avoids real world problems. So they would rather make up their own drug and say it's similar rather than just say, yeah, in the Warhammer world, we have this drug too. But the most common one that is at least similar is Weirdroot. And Weirdroot does pop up again and again. The difference, though, with Weirdroot and real-world equivalents is that Weirdroot is often given some oracular abilities, particularly for those who have got the latent magic capability within them. So you tend to find that Weirdroot, if you happen to be chewing it or otherwise taking it in, can have bad trips if you are, unknowing to yourself, magically sensitive. So yeah, that's super fun. And there's a couple of @LAWhammerings here. Let's just bring up one there. If you had to find an explanation for the giant river, if I was writing the giant river Holtrags, being able to speak and be seemingly intelligent and Throg's search for companionship, how would you go about it? That sounds like all is dust, that you're looking for some sort of troll bang going on there. Throg and the river hags. Oh, that is something I do not want to think about. But now you've made me think about it. Thanks for that. So would I see that as a potential route? Yeah, actually I would. One of the things, contrary to what my suggestion there may suggest, that I think is always amusing with most fantasy writing is their deep desire to avoid anything that may even be perceived as potentially sexual. And that is funny. We're fine with violence, but we're not fine with sex. So you tend to find that in a lot of my writing, I'm at least alluding to or mentioning or otherwise making it something that's a part of the setting. It's one of the reasons why I bought Raya back in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition as a primary deity. The acts of Raya, which is basically just a euphemism for having sex, should not be perceived as a negative, yet somehow Warhammer had brought up and weirdly concentrated on sex as if it was only to do with Slaanesh, which is just bonkers and wrong. If you can have all manner of warfare and not necessarily say that's just Khorne, you can have all manner of bonking, for want of a better word, and say that's nothing to do with Slaanesh. It was quite important to bring sexuality in the quite literal representation of a deity, a goddess of fertility, front and center back into the pantheon to make sure it was clear. So would I want to move into this area and explain it and do a super fun version of this? I think, yeah, all this dust. I think that would be fun. I think your suggestion there is at least one angle you could take. Throg, poor lonely chap, and there is potential routes out. I would, however, like to dive into the River Troll hags and just do more with them in general, because they were effectively just thrown out at the end of Forge World's existence and left to drown. And it would be super nice to do something very different with them, tie them into the overall setting in a way that's a bit more fun. Total War grabbed it a bit, I believe. I've still not dived into enough of Total War's lore for me to speak with any confidence there. But I will say that in general, yes. Right, so let's pick up another LAWhammering one. Next one that just popped up. Do you think that the partnership with Chaos Dwarves, Hobgoblins, could potentially be open to trade and diplomatic relationship from others? It would seem likely that they're less aggressive as pet. Okay, so basically what we're saying here is with the partnership with Chaos Dwarves, Hobgoblins could potentially be open to trade and diplomatic relationship with others. It seems likely they are less aggressive as pretty much the only option of dealing with the other factions of the Warhammer world. Yeah, the Chaos Dwarves, it's mentioned in more than one place, and the Hobgoblins by extension, work with other species, but you tend to find that they do so in a very Chaos Dwarf way. This is nicely covered in Tamarkan, where they've got a lovely breakdown for how Tamarkan persuades the Chaos Dwarfs to work with them. And that's by kicking their asses, because they absolutely refuse to work with, or indeed even deign to discuss with, anything that are beneath them. And Tamarkan had to basically hold them to a stalemate and potentially move over towards the almost losing side. So broadly speaking, yes, Hawk, definitely. Hey, Garrett, what would be my favorite food drink in the Warhammer world? So the Warhammer world has almost everything that we have in the real world, and they tend to add a few extras. I added a lovely little fermenti dish to the to the monastery of the Dark Maiden, and for reasons that to this day I have no idea why, it's stuck in my head, and I've always wondered what that frumenti in particular, you'd have to go read it, but it's both sweet and savory at once, and I've always wanted to try it, so I would most certainly be willing to give that one a go. The Spider God. Okay, so there's not a lot to say about the Spider God other than the Spider God pops up as loose reference here, there, an entire society of spiders sitting down near the Southlands, somewhat similarly connected, issues with forest goblins and exactly where they tie in. But I think the best thing I can say about the Spider God, if I'm being really honest, rather than just waxing lyrical about half murmured rumor, is that it's something that felt like it was trying to set something up for the future for Warhammer. And at some point, someone was going to pick it up and turn it into something. As it currently stands, it's not really happened. We've had lots of snippety bits of lore about it, enough that I reckon Sotek and I could probably do a stream. And I think a good way of judging just how much there is if you go look at the Fishman stream that we did, we managed to talk about the Fishman for about 3 hours. And I think Cryotek, Cryotek is a Scottish company that used to make used to make models up here. Cryomech models, that's going back a bit. So Cryotier. I think the best thing I can do about that one is actually suggest it as a potential subject, because I think I would quite like to do that. So I'm going to mark that into my notes over here. And I'm going to see if we can bring that one up with Sotek, because we're looking for a couple of lesser known subjects that are not the big ones that we can dive into. Fishmen, we really went to town with, and we unexpectedly got some really cool outcomes. And similarly, when we did our Dragon Ogre stream, do recommend go check out our Dragon Ogre stream that Sotek and I did. I can't remember whose channel it was. I think that's on Sotek's channel. I think it is. We managed to get what we felt was very little lore not just to stretch over 3 hours. It didn't stretch. It was chock-a-block full of content. And I would actually like to dive into that one with a little bit more depth. Hey, Cole! I'm running a D&D game. Nice. Set in the land based in mythic historical Bronze Age Greece. Nice. Do you have any ideas of advice? Definitely need to be careful. So if this is right for your own game, Cole, the first thing I'd say is don't worry too much about being careful. Do the stuff that you and your group really like. There's a big difference between creating something that's going to be public, which is what I'm often doing, or creating stuff for your own personal game. That being the case, you can go as wild as you like with your own games. Try to make it as cool as your players will find cool. But more generally, I can't recommend enough taking a look at other people's versions of what they've done with the same material. And that would be, for example, going to a Greece-based role-playing game. That could be going to a computer game like there's a whole bunch of them actually that are set in that era, some of which really use the art style well. Oh, there's a 2D side scroller, Hypothesis. I can't remember what it's called. And again, looking at those for ideas. But ultimately, if you're going mythic historic, that's an interesting mix, because both the myths and the history can combine very well Jason of Argonaut style if you wish to do so. And that's my general suggestion. That is cool. Just sink yourself in the stuff that you find cool. Find the stories that you think will be best represented. Think about what your players want. And as the biggest hint of all, if you are just building it just now, ask them. There's nothing like asking your players what they want to play and how that could be best represented to then ensure that you build a game that they really, really enjoy. And one of them might say something that you don't expect, like for me, you might have been thinking, oh, well, run around the islands. That'll be fun, right? Jason the Argonaut style. That'll be a laugh. And then one of them says something like, I really want to visit such and such an island. I don't know. They might pull upon an individual myth. Pull up that one like Circe and the pigs or whatever. And I really want to visit there. I really want to do something there, but I'd love it to have its own twist. So it wasn't that. Maybe it would be a real version of what happened that was the basis for the myth. And that just might make your mind immediately go, oh, I could do this. I could do that. So yeah, that. And as a last one, find a role-playing community who'd be willing to throw all the ideas at you as well, because there's nothing like crowdsourcing ideas. And an easy way to do that is, LAWhammer, or if you're up in, say, the Rookery, just ask in their general role-playing threads, what would you do with this? And you'll get tons of answers that might not be what you, expect. Do we have any more? Oh, we got a few more super chats in there, so I'm going to pull through these quickly. To Blam, Ty Blam. I'm not sure which it is. Thank you very much for super chat. Idea for the absence of Cathay from Age of Sigmar. Dragons not being included in the old one's plan and having a non-intervention pact with them till the end times. Now, I don't think they'd have a non-intervention pact. I don't think they would, at least. Although, Shinzi did his thing. So why aren't they there? That's the big question. And yes, it requires a very good answer. Games Workshop's normal answer is, we just didn't write about them yet. They were always there. Or alternatively, then they arrived. It's one or the other. I don't know if I prefer either of those. I think I would be looking to try and build a unique story that spoke about the old ones, that spoke about the old ones' plan, and spoke about the dragons being somewhere else doing something else. And then something happening in Age of Sigmar, which means that the extra place where they were got intruded upon. Something like that, I think, would be preferable, that allows you to have that, and then they arrived, but possibly it's then, and then they were invaded. Do it the other way around. Something like that. Try to mix up their standard breakdowns. I'm aware that we're now coming up to almost 10 to 7, and I'm going to be starting a stream over on Rookery on the hour where we're discussing how to adapt pre-published adventures and role-playing games to your tables at home. So I'm going to have to get through the next set relatively quickly. They said my brothers couldn't get new models, but Tamar can. Yeah, I'm in good one. Hey, Singemeister, do you have a favorite D&D god? I like, I'm somewhat broken by Baldur's Gate, the game. And the number of times I would go by bloody Candlekeep with Lord of Murder has perished. And it just bloody sunk that god into my psyche. I don't really have a favorite with D&D. I've done quite a few D&D products over the course of time. I've been involved with either producing books behind the scenes, or I've been producing new D&D realms. Just finished a book for a company called Tactical Adventures for example, and they've got their own Solasta game. Solasta was a D&D role-playing game on computer. And yeah, it was super fun to be working on too. But I don't really have any strong favorites. It's fun. But beyond the things you pick up from Baldur's Gate, and thus I've got a bit more personal connection to, D&D's never really been my bag. But I do love the games on the computer side. For Cole, try out Total War Saga Troy Mythos DLC. Yo, that's a good idea. Again, not heavy on my Total Warishness, but I do think that's a good idea. Anything that sinks you down into the setting is an absolute must, because that will immediately give you ideas, because you might play something and you might be frustrated by one of the stories that pops up and go, I could do that better. Suddenly you've got a new campaign idea. I'm running low on time, so I'm just going to grab first ones that pop up. Hey, Adrian, is there mixes of God's missing blessings that add up, like Slanesh plus Nurgle created? No, there isn't. The Chaos Gods are very, very discreet, but you might find that individual spells most certainly do seem to transgress and cross over, particularly given just how warlike most of the spells are, because most of the spells that you'll find inside Warhammer were created originally for the battle game, which means, broadly speaking, a spell to confuse, kill, otherwise do something to someone else's troops, or boost your own, which means that there's often a weird crossover, if you look behind it and realize what it is, with Khorne. So yes, there are all sorts of mixes, but they are definitely not in-game perceived to be a mix. And you could argue the same is the case for many of the other gods as well, where there is so much potential crossover, because really, what's the difference between one river god and another river god and another river god? But you've got one god called Grandfather Reich, another god called Delb, another one called, say, Bailarach over in the Bailarach marshes beside Sylvania. There's all sorts of Spilabog, pardon me. Not Bailarach, Bilabog, the Bailarach marshes. So there's all sorts of deities that are very similar, where you'll get things that appear to cross over, but ultimately they're all about that individual god's domain. And Lycor Gaming, did I pronounce that correctly? I hope so. Hey, Andy, no problem. Sorry to sound forcing, no problem. But can you answer my question above Dynaman on Twitch? I may have missed that one. Let me just roll up and see if it's there. Is this the one here? Hey, Andy. Hello again. Oh, have I missed one entirely? Okay, I'm now rolling back. Have I missed one? Okay, so repost the question down at the bottom in case I don't find it, because it didn't ping up on my side. Okay, there we go. You missed some questions on Twitch. So I've definitely missed some. Let me just scroll back with the deepest apologies. It's part of the way that the integrated software goes here on the StreamYard side. That's the piece of software I'm using. So I got Dynaman's one. I've just scrolled past that, and the other one didn't go. Oh, there it is. Ah, man, I apologize deeply. I don't know if you've been asked this already, but I wanted to know if greater demons could shapeshift to a human form. So this is a fascinating question in general. I'm just checking the times I heard Lindsay about to come through. This is a fascinating question in general, because greater demons, she's jogging around in the background, greater demons in general are not subtle at all. So if you had a greater demon in human form, it would still be a greater demon, and they change everything around them. They are the essence of the aether made manifest in the material realm. So a greater demon, let's go really blatant, Khorne, even if it was human-sized, would utterly change the world around it. The sky would be raining blood. Everyone around it would be devolving into bloodlust and frenzy. These are greater demons. These are not small things. They are never going to appear subtly, unless you are a god of pure subtlety. And then we have potentially different ways of popping out. Take the Changeling, for example. An entity of such extraordinary power, it fools the gods itself. It is effectively a greater demon, if you want to give such a term to it. And it can appear as anything, any creature, ranging from the big down to the small. So in this case, the answer is definitely we have the Changeling. As for others, because you tend to find that most of them are manifestations of a singular part of the Chaos God that they represent, like, for example, pure rage, pure excess, pure change, or whatever, their very nature is unlikely to be constrained by something as simple as a human form. But that doesn't mean that in individual greater demon cases that wouldn't be the case. I've also missed another one there from Dino Man, and again, Very sorry for missing those. How are the Northern Waste, Norska, etc., so inhospitable yet able to support unending hordes of millions? They are not inhospitable. It's an absolute lie. This is one thing that is actually hilarious, because again and again we have characters that droop all the way up into the wastes and come all the way back down again. What the Northern Wastes is super dangerous and also super prone to causing mutation, because it's a little bit like a massive irradiated land. Can you survive Fallout style in irradiated land? Yes. Is it going to screw you up? Almost certainly. In this case, it's going to screw up most people yet. There are all manner of, as you say, tribal people, humans, other things up there that not only survive, they thrive. The only thing that's worth noting is try not to use the models, or indeed even the Total War models, as an example of what they all are, because most of them, to one small degree or another, are mutated, completely permeated by the winds of magic and the mutation that comes from that when it's so strong near the good old, well, let's call it the Eye of Chaos, Eye of Sauron style, blazing out horror all around it. The land itself is broken and mutated, as are many of the people. But that also brings advantage, because it's not a frozen hellscape, because the standard rules don't apply. There's lush jungles up there. There's deep caves that are filled with edible things. Life goes out of control because there's so much Gyron. Many of it's intelligent. It's the realms of chaos. Everything's twisted and weird. There is a vast abundance of stuff up there, which means that survival is much more easy than many expect, while simultaneously being absolutely near impossible. I'm going to dive back and just make sure that there's no other ones that I missed there, because I am feeling exceedingly guilty about the ones that I did. I'm not seeing any more. If I have missed any more chats, please do put them down at the bottom, because I think I've gone past them all there. I hope I've gone past them all there. So thank you very much for those. I'm just going to check the time, so I'm going to stay on for about another couple of minutes. I'll answer another couple of questions just before I go. Before I go, a couple of things to say. I'm about to start a stream over on the Rookery side. I imagine they're already starting their countdown if they haven't started already. That's Rookery Publications on both Twitch and YouTube, and hell, they're even on Facebook and Twitter, well, X, and elsewhere as well. So they're pretty much everywhere. And we're going to be discussing role-playing and adapting pre-printed material for your own games. It's going to be a super fun one. We're going to be, Lindsay's going to be chatting, I'm going to be chatting, Annie's going to be chatting. I'm not sure if anyone else is turning up, but I think that's who's going to be there. So that's starting in a moment. And if you haven't already, do pre-order Dark Deeds. You can buy it now. Game from good pals over at Rookery Publications and Andy Chambers as well. So that being said, let's see if we can get a couple of questions in before we come to an end. Hey, oh, here's one. What do you think about the Grill Knights being 3 models for around about 40 quid? Wow, is that the case? Is it 40 quid after a rough currency exchange? Well, there's 40 quid for 3 models. I think that's a lot of money. The Grill Knights rock, but that's a lot of money. Games Workshop models have always gone up in price year on year in. It doesn't surprise me in the slightest. I'm just going to pass on over here because I'm going to do something I don't think I've ever done before, which is I'm going to try and read other channel. You might hear me talking up there. Yeah, I'll just move that there because apparently I can read my own channel. I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to try and read Rookery Publications once we're finished here. So yes, that's definitely a lot of money for the old world. I'm going to have to go check that one out because I'm not sure. Hawk Audley is on the ball. That's what you should do. Pre-order Dark Deeds. Cash Slaughter, I'm guessing the pronunciation. Hey Andy, hiya. I'm running a One Fancy Roleplay vampire campaign. Fun. They are about to fight a plague kraken. Oh my goodness. Of the I'm wondering what are some fun things that they could do there circa 2480. Holy man. I mean, just fighting off a plague kraken sounds all manner of awesome. I don't know what you've done in your campaign. I'm going to be taking my campaign over to Lustria. That's LAWhammer. So the host of things that I'm going to be doing, assuming that I do the second season, which I do intend to do, I don't want to spoil any of that. So I'm not going to tell you all the things that I'd like to do, but I would definitely involve at least one subplot with the Lizardmen. I would be looking for at least one Dark Elf slave raid. I would be looking for at least one example of different species and races that you might find over in Nagaroth that are not the ones that we know from the battle game. Create something new and interesting and exciting. But ultimately, I'd be really dialing down and trying to make it as fun as possible. I know it's a rubbish answer, but I'm near the end of time and I've got to run over to the other stream in a moment. Say, Sam, your favorite part of the Chaos Waste that no one knows about? The only ones that no one knows about, the ones that I've made up myself and never actually published. There was a god up there called Kelner Machnalach, which is a ridiculous name, but I still remember, and I made it when I was 14. That's ridiculous. So there you go. The stuff that no one really knows about. That I'm actually going to bring up the one that I said earlier because no one really understands it. The Chaos Wastes are very, very habitable. They're just freaking dangerous. And people forget about that because they go to massive extremes with everything. And on that, Bob, it is wise to put it on because I will often miss them if you don't. I'm then going to say thanks very much to everyone that's made it. It has been an absolute joy. I'm about to go and pop over to Rookery Publications. I don't know how to do a raid. So I'm going to give it a go and see if it works. Did that work? No, it didn't. God damn it. At least I tried. That being the case, I'm now going to pop off and say thanks very much for everyone that turned up. Do join us on Rookery Publications channel. That would be amazing. We're about to be there in about a minute. So do go see me over on the other side. See you all soon. Hey, Hawk, can you make it raid over? Because that's what I tried to do. I must have done it wrong. Because that'd be great if you can do that. I don't know if you can. But I'm leaving now, so I shall see you all very soon. Bye-bye.